how would you deal with the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
I would do everything I could to try to develop, strengthen, and make effective a Palestinian faction that was prepared to defeat Hamas if necessary in order to find peace in the region. I do not see how you can get to, and I think this is a core problem in how people analyze this. If Hamas says not a single Jew will remain, and if Hezbollah says not a single inch of territory will remain, the idea you're going to get to a negotiated peace is ludicrous. I mean, you have to win the war. Now, to win the war, I mean, the great failure has been, and Israel has to bear a lot of the burden of this. Despite a 40-year opportunity, the Israelis have never figured out how to grow a generation, a faction of Palestinians who would be safer, more prosperous, and freer if they were fighting for peace than if they were fighting for terrorism. And similarly, in Lebanon, we have not been able to find a way to convince the Lebanese government, which is legitimately more afraid of Syria, more afraid of Iran, and more afraid of Hezbollah than they are of the United States. We have not been able to convince them that the United States and the Lebanese government could, in fact, defeat Hezbollah and drive Syria out of Lebanon. And so the Lebanese government will not, in fact, cooperate in establishing peace.
This refers a bit to the question that was asked, though. Tom Friedman recently wrote a column that says the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the most important issue for the United States. It is Iran. And it is Iran because of their influence, funding, and support of Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah. And that is the most crucial issue in American foreign policy.
Well, it's also the most crucial issue in Israeli foreign policy, because Iran, the first person I met with after I became Speaker, the first foreign leader, was Prime Minister Rabin, who came over before I was sworn in, and I met with he and Tom Foley, the Democratic Speaker. And Prime Minister Rabin said the reason he was trying to find a deal with Arafat is that Iran was an existential threat to the very survival of Israel, and they had to find a way to get past the Palestinian problem to deal with Iran. He said, I don't have any solution. Iran is such a big country, and it is potentially so threatening that I literally don't know what we're going to do.
At the same time, there are a lot of people who believe that there's a very, very strong reform element in Iran.
Look, there's a strong reform element in Iran, and there were a lot of Germans who weren't Nazis. And there were, you know...
I mean, I realize that's short and quick, but explain to me what policy, what it demands of the United States with respect to the reform, because it is frequently said that there are two opinions in Washington about Iran. Right. One is that we have to defeat them, you know, and two is we have to change their behavior.
There is, I believe analytically, we have to be absolutely dedicated to replacing both the North Korean and Iranian dictatorships, and we have to communicate to the Syrians that if they annoy us much, we'll replace them too. I think you replace them the way Reagan defeated the Soviet Empire. I mean, he did not send the American army into Poland. He designed a grand strategy that involved economics, psychology, an alliance with the church, helping the labor union movement, solidarity. I mean, but we should be very clear about this. The North Korean and Iranian dictatorships are mortal threats to our survival.
So you are saying that rather than negotiate with them, as we have just done in Chris Hill representing the United States, and in concert with the Chinese and other people in the region, we should say to the leader of North Korea, the leader of North Korea, we want to overthrow you one way or the other, but we want to change you as head of North Korea.
Oh,
That's what we should say to them. Not negotiate, just say, here's our intention to get rid of you.
I'm happy to talk with them and say the following. If you would like to turn over all of your nuclear weapons and you would like to turn over all of your nuclear facilities, we will ignore you.
Okay, fair enough.
If you don't want to do that, our goal is to replace your regime by enabling the people you have oppressed, brutalized, and starved to govern themselves in freedom.
Give me a policy to do that.
First thing you ought to do is pay every smuggler you can find to smuggle every good into North Korea they can smuggle, because you begin to break up the authoritarian power of the regime. And you force people to say, okay, I could actually have rice and have dinner over here if I deal with a smuggler, or I could be totally starving, but at least I'll still love the beloved leader. And all of a sudden, you would rapidly decay that. This is what happened to the Soviet Union. I mean, the entire rise of a second economy in the Soviet Union shattered the capacity of the KGB to maintain control.
What would you do? Well, let me just go to Iran then. What would you do to overthrow the regime in Iran if they refused to meet whatever your conditions were for survival?
First of all, 49% of Iran is non-Persian speaking, non-Farsi speaking. Second, there's a very strong labor union movement among the bus drivers and truck drivers who are constantly being oppressed. There's a strong labor union movement in the oil fields. There are students who riot about every other week in Tehran. There are substantial elements that
all
aren't
part of the reformist element.
Oh, that's right. I mean, there's a huge reformist element under the regime, but they're not. You're not going to be able to negotiate with the regime. The regime kicked over 10,000 candidates off the ballot. So if the CIA had any level of competence, it would have its first mailing list. I mean, you take the 10,000 people, you know. But there's one specific example that I'm just amazed by. Iran produces a lot of crude oil and very little gasoline. And the gasoline it produces...
Meaning that they don't have gasoline as a natural resource like they have oil as a natural resource.
They only have one refinery for gasoline in the whole country.
Right.
And
it's all in Russia.
And they have to import 40% of their gasoline.
And Qatar, right.
Right. The capacity to limit their gasoline supply, if you're the most powerful naval country in the world, is limitless.
Let me just hear you out. You think that that the ideas you have for Iran and North Korea would be successful in changing those regimes, let's say, in 4 years? Say take a 4 years, 2008 to 2012.
It took, you'd have to, I'll let you decide, Charlie. It took, the Soviet Empire was fairly large, fairly stable. Most intellectuals who you would have talked to in 1980 would have told you it was a formidable and permanent part of our world, and it disappeared 9 years after Ronald Reagan called it an evil empire.
I'm asking this, you're the history professor. Would it have happened if somebody named Gorbachev had not risen to power in the Soviet Union?
Not as rapidly.
It would have been later.
It would have been later, but they
Maybe
were,
not,
but they were, but they were
not
clearly,
within the regime.
but they were collapsing. There's no question
Because of
they
their,
were disintegrating.
their military and economic power
Well,
had a weakness at the core.
Reagan adopted, and Peter Schweitzer covers this brilliantly in two books, one called Victory and the other called Reagan's War. Reagan adopted a series of strategies in parallel, one of which, and it's a very interesting act of leadership, he, in effect, undermined his own financial allies in Texas and Oklahoma by cutting a deal with the Saudis, who were very angry about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the Saudis drove the price of oil down to $6 or $8 a barrel at a time when the Soviets could not survive financially below $20. And they just basically stripped all the hard currency out of the Soviet Union.
I'm moving on. My mother never misses your show. She adores you. I didn't know you had a show.
This was to you.
Oh! It's true. It's true.